So who is that's for both of us, I presume, that question. Do you want to respond first, Bill?
During the center lane time period, prior to us going over to DIA, when we changed code words, Joe McMonagle was the main viewer. Of course, Tom came along, was a little ahead of us in the training. We were used in a CRV mode, Joe in an ERV mode. I think that was later on after center lane. We had more trained viewers. We had the option of using a viewer either in ERV or CRV, so we could work a site with maybe 2 viewers, maybe 3 viewers, and maybe 2 working CRV, 1 working ERV.
So I think there was a bit of a mistranslation problem here. Not exactly, but he was talking about solo viewing, where you don't have a monitor.
Oh no, I don't recall ever working anything operationally.
Yeah.
Without a monitor.
Yeah. So first off, I think you guys you need to kind of understand that center lane actually was a very short period. Really, it started in late 1983. And then ended in the end of 1984. And then there was this interim project called Dragoon Absorb, which was this bridge time between when the Army was done with us and DIA got the full responsibility for us. But during that period of time, DIA had what we called operational control of the unit during the Dragoon Absorb period. And then at the end of January in 1986, then we became fully DIA, and that's when Sunstreak began. So you've got these 2 relatively short periods. Before center lane, of course, was Grill Flame, and that went on for 4 or 5 years, I guess. So before center lane was Grill Flame, 4 or 5 years, center lane about 1.5 years, Dragoon Absorb 1 year, and then Sunstreak for 5 years until they changed the name again. So, and as far as solo remote viewing, we never did it during center lane, and as far as I know, never during Grill Flame. We always had monitors, and that was the guidance from SRI. They, in assessing solo versus monitored, they determined that having a monitor generally was superior to not having one. Of course, today, most people don't have the ability to have a monitor, so solo viewings become the norm rather than the exception. And this was after Bill left, during Sunstreak, they did just experiment with solo viewing. Most of the time we had monitors, but they did one project where they used solo remote viewing, and they weren't really thrilled with the results. So they went back to using a monitor.
Were there psychological profiles or kind of that decided whether someone in the unit would become a viewer or a monitor or an analyst?
Okay. I want to defer to Bill because he's my superior officer here. If he wants to answer it, I have an answer, but if he wants to answer it, I'll give him first crack.
It was a value judgment based not on any personality test, based on our perception of the individual. There were people who we did not want viewing, or we trusted less as a viewer, more as a monitor. And actually, the hardest jobs in the unit, I thought, were the monitors and the analysts, which kind of usually turned out to be the same person. I know we'd all be going home, Paul and I, we'd be waving as we walked out the door, and Gene and Ed would be typing away for the next couple hours. So it's,
Yeah, that's basically true. It's kind of value judgment, subjective judgment. So when you're in an operational setting, you make the best judgment you can, and it's often based on experience. And so when the people who made these decisions, which wasn't me in most cases, it was sometimes Bill, but oftentimes it was Skip Atwater, they would go on their experience of people in the past and the person that they were making the decision about in the present and what their experience had been, and then decide whether they're going to spend their time as an analyst or, well, yeah, as a monitor, project manager, so more of an administrative role, or as a remote viewer. But there was a little bit of an element too. So we tended to use the Myers-Briggs a bit, the Myers-Briggs personality type inventory, right? And the Myers-Briggs categorizes people between perceptive and judging. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of this because the words that are used in Myers-Briggs assessments aren't exactly understood the same way when we use them in regular society. But judging versus perception, a person who is strongly in the judging element tends to want closure right now. They tend to be analytical. They tend to be fact-oriented, particularly if they have a strong sensing as opposed to an intuitive element, and if they have a thinking versus a feeling component. So someone who has got STJ particularly quite strongly in their Myers-Briggs profile, they tend to be what we would just kind of vaguely hand-wavingly say they're left-brained. And left-brain people do much better as analysts, even monitors, project managers, than they do as viewers. Now, it's not universally true, but the tendency is it is true. Bill is a J, but he also has a strong N and sort of borderline F and between F and T. So he's kind of a, as I'm recalling, am I remembering you correctly, Bill?
I tend to go back and forth between J and P depending upon my job. If I was commander, I was a J. If I wasn't, then I was a P,
Okay.
which is supposed to happen.
Yeah. So Bill was not strong over in the elements that make a person, really ideal to be an analyst, etc. He could function that way, right? So the people who ended up being typecast, if you will, as monitors and such over, Ed Dames pegged out on the judging side. He was, and the T and the J and probably the S, although I don't remember his profile in that respect. So from a personality perspective, he was much better suited as a manager, monitor, etc., than he was as a viewer. And that was borne out, actually. That was definitely borne out over the years. So anyway, I think that answers your question.
But without the Myers-Briggs to back us up, those were the perceptions we had of the individuals. The Myers-Briggs was just the proof of the way they acted. In fact, Ed would come in every morning, we'd go outside and he would tell me the meaning of life. And then he would get one or two more bits of information during the day and during that night. And we'd come in the morning and he would say, Bill, can I talk to you? This is the meaning of life. And we did that day in, day out. Yeah.
And every time the meaning of life was different.
Different, yes.
Okay.
But he had closure every time.
Yeah.
Whereas Paul, no.
I said life? Was it?
Paul and Ed were the exact opposite.
Yeah.
Yep.
So I've had to teach myself, force myself to function in a left brain mode, and I still don't enjoy it. I'd much prefer not to have to do that. But the world doesn't reward you
No.
so much for being, kind of loosey-goosey.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. If I had an admin task, I could give it to Ed and say, Ed, I need this in 30 days. And at the end of the weekend, he would bring it to me. If I had an admin task for Paul, I would break it into thirds, and it had to be done in 30 days. I would give him the task and say, Paul, I need this 1/3 of the task done in 10 days. He would do it. But on the 9th day, I'd have to remind him.
And Bill would get it on, and Bill would get it on the 12th day.
Yeah. And then I give him the next part. I got a better product, but I had to stick with it with Paul. With Ed, the product was not as good, not as well written, but I was sure it was going to be there on time. And then I got the meaning of life also. So it was a win-win. We ran about 12 people normally. Yeah. And we kind of functioned outside the boundaries, and to the point where it was a little uncomfortable. We had to make sure that the higher command knew what we're doing. We had to go to them. They normally didn't come to us. We went to Wally when he was down at Fort Meade. General Stubblebine would come down, I don't know, maybe once a quarter, once every 2 months, usually about 6 o'clock, and we would set up a big board showing them what we're working on, things, and he would come in and to get his briefing, and we never went through anything. He would tell us his dreams and tell us what happened. And then I remember one dream where the cat ate the world, and he wanted to know what we thought of that. And I thought that was very interesting, but we actually should have, as an intelligence gathering entity, we should have had more supervision. I think the people there were of the caliber that we never abused that. In fact, if anything was going on, we would let higher headquarters know. But the Army kind of works the other way. Higher headquarters kind of rides you. You don't go tell them this is what's going on.
Except in our case, yeah. So when you say it was kind of like a family, and it was in a way, including not just the getting along and the fun times together, but the arguing and the infighting happened as well. It's like a bunch of brothers and sisters who don't always get along. And as the program developed, partly because of the lack of supervision that Bill just mentioned, the divisions in the office got worse. And I think it was really a management problem. There's just some really bad management going on. And, you know, it contributed to the colorful history of the program, but it didn't necessarily help progress in the remote viewing world. So
my number one concern when hiring anybody new for the project was not the Myers-Briggs, not their experience, was can they get along in a small office? Because if you got somebody who turned out was less than a mediocre viewer, you know, you could give them a bunch of admin tasks to free other people up, and the unit would go on. But if you got somebody who was a good viewer, but had a personality conflict and started, having clicks going against one another, then in a small unit you can't afford that. So it was better to have somebody who wasn't as talented than to have somebody who was going to be disruptive.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd say you're right.
Who is coming up with this weird names like raccoon absorb?
Which one? Oh, drag. Oh,
drag and absorb. Drag.
Yeah. So you have to understand how code names are come up with, or nicknames. These are actually project nicknames.
Yeah.
So when you have a classified program, you have to have a way of talking about it in open source. Like if you're talking to a congressional staffer, you want to be able to talk about the program without saying, yeah, the remote viewing program, right? So they came up with these nicknames, and this is the case with most classified programs. What happens normally is every 5 years you change the classified or the unclassified nickname, so that if the bad guys figure out what it means, then they'll lose track of it because the new name comes out, right? So what they do is they have a computer and it generates two lists. You have one list of names and words and another list of names and words. And then the project manager, the security manager of the project, goes in and picks one word off of one list and another word off the other list and just puts them together. So you come up with weird things like Wheel of Flame, Dragoon Absorb, what was the original one? Gondola Wish, Sunstreak, and Stargate were a little fussy with that because, well, I think with Sunstreak, there was Sun on the list and Streak on the list, and somebody said, well, those sound good together. And so they put them together. Probably same thing with Grill Flame, actually, right?
Yep.
Sunstreak, however, Stargate, the way that happened was Dale Graff was the project manager, or the branch chief, whatever they called him back then at that point. And he was tasked with coming up with a new name. So they gave him 2 lists. The first one had Star on it. He liked that sound pretty good. But he looked on the second list and there was not a word that went with Star that he liked. He said, I don't want it. One day he's driving home. He lived down in Southern Maryland. He's driving home and he sees a gate alongside the road. He thinks, Star Gate. I like that sound, Stargate, right? And so he said, all right, we're going to call it Stargate. Now, understand that was before the movie, that was before the TV series, before they were ever even thought of. And he came up with that name. So people wonder if it has something to do with the movie and the TV. No, it was original and started before they did. So yeah, the nicknames are normally randomized, but even in modern day now, for example, they've got what was the operation? What was the Iraqi intervention thing called, Bill? You remember what? Restore Freedom.
Storm, Desert Storm.
No, the later one.
Oh, the later one, Iraqi Freedom.
Yeah. See, that was not computer generated, obviously. They started realizing, at least for these things that are going to be in the news, having a nice, phrase that signified what you're trying to do for publicity purposes.
Yeah. Marketing.
Yeah. I mean,
but that was classified. The thing is,
yeah, that's true. Yeah.
People knew we were in Iraq. It was,
yeah.
It wasn't like Overlord or something.
Yeah. Still in classified programs, they still don't want a easily identifiable label. So anyway, sorry, that was more of an answer than you really wanted, probably.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. We see movies can change history. Stargate and remote viewing is connected to goats now.
Goats. Yes, unfortunately, yes. A story that almost certainly didn't actually happen, but you get a journalist who has questionable journalistic ethics, in my opinion. And
I don't think you need to. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you want to talk about goats? I have a strong opinion about this men who stare at goats thing. So, all right. So, no, never mind. We won't go there. That's a distraction.
A different question now. It's
hopefully it's different. I wouldn't want to have to give you the same answer.
Okay, we can try.
He can give you the same answer.
We can cut it together afterwards with every time.
That's tempting.
Yeah. So the next question is maybe the next few questions are about telepathic overlay. It's a thing we are thinking about a lot. And there is a 1996 paper written by Ingo. And in this paper, he said that he identified telepathic overlay in remote viewing together with Harl Potthoff. And that there is no further research in the remote viewing field on that. That was 1996. So back then it was theoretical, and he referred to hypnosis states. And was telepathic overlay an issue in your working in military days?
I think I'll start with this, but then I'll turn it back to Bill. So first off, it's been a while since I read that full paper. I have it actually sitting in my desk, but I haven't had a chance to get to it, given all the other things you guys have had me doing. So, but I am somewhat familiar with it, and parts of it have been drawn to my attention. So first off, I don't know. Yes, the theoretical paper, but it obviously is based on experiences. Otherwise, it wouldn't even have come up. what those were at the time in the mid 70s at SRI, of course, neither Bill nor I have any access to. We don't know. I would not call it a major problem at Fort Meade even. And of course, the biggest problem with telepathic overlay occurs when, it's not the only problem, but the biggest problem, when you get people tasking you with anomaly targets that don't actually exist. And then you start getting telepathic overlay from the guy who tasks it, because that's the only really strong signal out there, is this guy's own preconceptions and biases about the target. That is the major generator of telepathic overlay. And because so many people out in the remote viewing world right now are wanting to remote view UFOs or Bigfoot or ETs or whoever or whatever the phenomenon, the alleged phenomenon is, you're bound to get an overabundance of telepathic overlay happening. Now, not to say that some UFO events aren't real and so on, but quite often there is a very strong opinion held by the tasker or other people, which itself, even if the event is correct, the opinion can bleed over just because that person really, really, really wants the viewers to confirm what that person believes about the event. So you run into that kind of an issue as well. In an operational setting, it can happen due to other reasons, but, well, the related reasons, but it's much less likely because there is a confirmed target there. When you're working with professionals, professional taskers, professional analysts, professional monitors, these folks know to not draw firm conclusions about the target in advance, to approach it from a as neutral a possible perspective as possible. And if you do that, telepathic overlay becomes much less of a problem. In fact, it almost becomes unlikely.
Mhm. So you say the main cause of telepathic overlay is on the side of the tasker and not on the monitor.
On esoteric targets.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, we had experiences with viewers here in Germany or interesting situations where two viewers had different results for the same question, and the results corresponded with the opinion of their monitors.
Yeah.
Well,
I was going to say that quite frequently what we call telepathic overlay is a failure on the part of the monitor. The monitor must give no clues. And what's happening is the viewer who's out there wandering around and has a certain fear of failure and is trying, and he comes up with something and the monitor jumps on it. Okay, there's a structure here. Tell me about the structure. And right away, the viewer is homing into the structure. Now, the next guy comes and works it. And once again, he comes up with a structure, and the monitor, either through body language, through voice, whatever, indicates that that's what he's interested in. And if the monitor may be blind, but he has come up with a thing in his mind that he thinks, this is area 51, I'm sure. So there must be, and that's what's driving the viewer. And it's not telepathic overlay, it's a failure on the part of the monitor.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So in fact, Bill is talking about a couple of different things here, but I do want to say that the scenario he just described was one we ran into over and over again with Ed Dinks. He would have an opinion about it, even when he was blind. He'd have an opinion about a target, or he would even be down at the end of the table, supposedly acting as monitor, remote viewing it as well. And for Pete's sake, that's a recipe for confusion and disaster. So what Bill, I think, is talking about is the monitor not being able to maintain a neutral perspective. And so what they're doing is telegraphing to the viewer through their inflection, their voice, or through their behavior, things that the viewer thinks, the monitor thinks are right. So even if the monitor doesn't know what it was, but partway through the session says, oh, I know what this is, blah, 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 in their head, they're saying in their head, and then they start responding to the viewer in ways that reinforce that. The viewer will then start describing what the monitor is kind of telegraphing. Now, of course, that's not exactly telepathic overlay, A telepathic overlay is where the thoughts of the monitor are what are influencing the viewer. And so that is a possibility as well. In particularly in the anomaly circumstances, the tasker is the source of the telepathic overlay. If a viewer or if a monitor has a strong opinion, that may also influence the session. It can. That's a form of telepathic overlay. There's a third scenario where another viewer, if you have a team running, another viewer may have a strong opinion about what they're perceiving, and that becomes then accessible to the other viewers, and they will kind of in a way get entrained with the opinion or the impressions of the stronger viewer. And usually when we're talking about stronger viewer, only stronger in terms of forming AOL. Usually if the viewer is actually on, then that person will actually, if there is telepathic overlay, it will actually serve to bring the other viewers into the right perceptions. But if it's an AOL, obviously, if the other viewers buy into an AOL, they end up confirming what the strong viewer is fantasizing. And then the analyst, they're going to think there was a confirmation here because all three viewers are reporting similar stuff, when it's not. They just have gotten entrained by the other viewer. So, and when I say stronger viewer, it doesn't necessarily mean that viewer is a better viewer. It just means maybe in a certain session, that viewer just forms this conclusion and just kind of runs away with it. So
it's like the first viewer leave a trace in this target, and the second and third viewer picks it up.
Well, I wouldn't say it that way. It's not like they leave a trace. It's like the other viewers pick up on that viewer's mental contents, and those mental contents are quite vivid or strong, and so they become kind of entrained by that. Okay,
one of the ways that we prevented this from happening is no viewer knew what other viewers were working your target. You have multiple targets, multiple viewers, and you might have two viewers working the same target, but they wouldn't know it. So I think there may be a tendency, if you're out there and you're lost and you're, just for a second, rather than, going back, keeping in structure, what did Joe get on this, I wonder? But if you don't know if Joe or Paul or anybody else worked it, then you don't go there.
Yeah.
And if there is a problem, you can work the strongest viewer last. Though I'm not sure time is meaningful, but yeah. But as long as nobody knows who else is working the target, that tends to hold it down somewhat.
Yeah, it does help, that's for sure.
Normally, you compare the sessions of different viewers and look for similarities. And so how can you be sure that this is real stuff, pure data?
Most of the time it is. And there may be some clues. If one viewer is saying this is like Saudi Arabia, and somebody else comes up with like Saudi Arabia, they may be going the same way, but an experienced analyst may be able to pick that up. And we use the analyst as the monitors in most cases. So they were there when the information came in. It gives you a certain feeling about the veracity of the information.
Yeah, there is value in that because an analyst who's one step removed from the process is not going to understand as much how the information is produced. Now, on the other hand, they also can't bias the product in a way. But generally speaking, the bottom line is, if there's subtle telepathic overlay going on, you can't detect it. You don't know it's happening, which is why, particularly in our environment, but in any remote viewing environment, you need to use what we used to call in the Army all source intelligence, right? You don't, unless you absolutely have to, take the remote viewing data alone as the only thing. And in the intelligence world, you never take a particular intelligence element or a particular intelligence source as your only source, because notoriously, one source can be wrong. When you have other sources involved, they can help confirm or reject information that you're getting. In a remote viewing project, you produce the remote viewing information, but in the final analysis, you really need to have an analyst who has access to non-remote viewing derived data as well, because that's the way you sort out what the bottom line is. You get a lot of folks out there thinking, well, we've arrived at ground truth because I've had 3 remote viewers say XYZ. And maybe you did arrive at ground truth, but you haven't, until you confirm it with some other information, you cannot be sure that that is ground truth. We see oftentimes people putting way too much faith in remote viewing results. Sometimes you have to. I mean, there were cases when we were doing the counter narcotics thing where all the information they had about it was what a remote viewer produced, or multiple remote viewers. We still had success in that setting because it turned out the viewers were right. But until you have at least some kind of corroboration or confirmation, you can't ever absolutely assume the viewers are right. Just like you can't always absolutely assume that your human intelligence sources, your informants, are always right. Or just like you can't always assume that your signals intelligence take is absolutely right. It could well be out there that the enemy knows you're listening in and is telling you lies. And people don't understand the intelligence world is a very tricky thing. And even in a remote viewing environment, that's still a problem. Now, Bill said that the monitors were often the analysts as well. That's true. They were the first stage analysts. They weren't the ultimate analysts. They weren't the ones who were actually deciding what all this stuff meant. What they did was they went through and analyzed the results they got and gave a remote viewing oriented kind of report. Then that was sent up to a main analyst who had access to the other information as well. And then they were able to sort out how much of that was real, how much of it wasn't.
Mhm.
There is no intelligent discipline that wants to be a sole source, whether it be satellites, human source, because they all can be tricked. But when you have 2, 3 different information coming in from human intelligence and electric intelligence, you're getting photo intelligence, and remote viewers are telling you. Now, one thing that remote viewing may have been better at than any of the other sources was queuing the other sources. This is where we need to put our resources, because we think this is what's going on there. Now, if it is
Yeah.
but the value is now we can target human sources against that electronics and other things without going into.
Yeah, it's really valuable for that, particularly when you're dealing with denied areas. So denied area, of course, was a technical term in the intelligence world, which is a facility or something that we couldn't get human intelligence spies, essentially, couldn't get spies into, couldn't get any photographic intelligence was useful, no signals intelligence. It was essentially a black hole for the other intelligence sources. But you could get a remote viewer in there, right? And that's where it came in very useful. Sometimes a remote viewer wouldn't be right, but very often they would be right. And then that would open up opportunities to figure out how to access that with our other intelligence sources as well. It's very useful in that respect.
Remote viewing is not dangerous, despite what some people have
Except
said.
to the other side.
To the other side. Yeah, we can go into that denied area and say, yes, there's something worthwhile here, give what we're perceiving. And then you can send a human intelligence asset in, which is dangerous, and but the risk may be worth somebody's life going in to get it, or having one of our systems, electronics or otherwise, compromised. But we have said it's now worthwhile. So you've upped the ante enough so we can use other sources.
Mhm.
It depended on the assets we had available, I think. Yep. For a time, Joe McMonica was our only asset for a while. And so it was how often we could work Joe on something. I think it was always at least 2 sessions. Normally, you can work 2 people 2 times each. That would, and if you got enough confirmation, you were solid with that, Or if you had the asset and there was nothing else as critical, you could work 4 or 5 viewers a couple times. But it's an operational question. It's resources available. Yep. With the veracity of the product you want to put out.
Yeah.
And how difficult the session is.
Based on the historical record, there were projects where we only submitted 1 session. Those are the minority, and I think it was because, well, there's a lot of reasons why that would be. One is we had 1 source, 1 viewer. They had an opportunity window for 1 session, and then other stuff was going on. Sometimes they would, occasionally 1 session actually answered the question. That was quite rare. Sometimes they would submit the session and the customer would say, nah, this is totally off. I don't want any more. Sometimes, let's see, I had another case in mind. And I'm blanking on what the other circumstances were, but there's a number of reasons why you may or may not submit more than 1 session. But most of them had more than 1 session. Some of them had, well, the Iranian hostage situation, they had a couple of 100 or more sessions, although those were targeted at different aspects of that problem. So you could say the targets were different amongst those several hundred. There was one that the Sari Shagan projected energy facility out in, what, I guess that's Eastern Russia. I don't know where it is. It depends how you look at it, which way around the globe you're going, right? Sari Shagan is an air defense site, but that's where they had centered their projected energy weapon research. That was when I worked on, and I did 11 sessions on that. They're in the CIA archive, all 11 of them. And then there were 2 or 3 other viewers that worked 1 or 2 sessions each. So altogether, you come up with 15, somewhere between 15 and 20 sessions, worked on that 1 specific project. So, so it varied significantly, partly depending on how well it was working, how well the viewers got it together, and maybe to some degree whether the customer wanted you to go back and address it. So they would you generate the information through remote viewing sessions, do this first order analysis, send that information off to the customer, and then it was up to them to run that against what they already knew, and then or could find out from other means, and then come back to you with more specific targeting. They might say, well, viewer X described this facility on page 5 of their session in such and such a way. We would like you to have that viewer go back to that facility and see if they can develop additional information. Okay. And so what you do with the viewer is you'd say, okay, on such and such date, you did this session, and on this page 6, whatever I said, page 6, you did this sketch and you talked about this structure. We'd like you to get back into session and describe any other more detailed information you can get about it. Okay, so now the viewer isn't totally blind in this case, right? The viewer now knows that you are interested in that. Okay, so in a way they're sort of front loaded, but in this case they're being front loaded with their own data, right? So that works. I know this is a little bit of a sidebar from where you guys were going with your questions, but it does illustrate an important point as far as tasking. It's okay to let the viewer know they were right about that one thing, or at least they may be right. So in this case, they don't know for sure they were right. You don't even know for sure they were right. You just know that the customer thinks there might be something useful there, right? And so it's okay if you give that back to the viewer, as long as you don't add any more information to it than the viewer provided you in the first place.
Mm-hmm. So there would be the opportunity to make a retasking with another, a totally different reference number, or does it work better to do this with this front loading?
You'd have to decide which one was going to give you the cleanest result. And you could use either approach, but there may be reason to think, well, if I give the viewer, if I tell them we want you to talk about what you just told us about in this session, if you think that that was actually going to lead the viewer off in some direction, then you might want to just do a clean retasking, even though that was the target. The viewer wouldn't know that. So you just have to decide what made sense as far as what you were up to.
Might depend on the viewer or the monitor and your
Mhm.
knowledge of them.
Mhm.
Yeah, usually just, I think just a retasking of the same number would be okay. But if you have,
Well, you might,
want to do that.
yeah, you might actually have to alter the number to some degree. So how I do it when I do an operation is, let's say this is the first project of 2023, then it would be the overall project would be 2301. Now I'm just telling you how I do it, right? There's lots of different ways to do it. 2301, and that would be the initial tasking to describe the general concept. And then if they produced a structure that I was interested in, then I might rewrite or create a new tasking, 230102 being the second tasking, referring to that. Now, of course, they have no idea what those numbers are consciously. Oh, excuse me. But they would, this stuff's pretty potent. Maybe I shouldn't drink so much of it. I don't know. So, yeah, so that's how you can refine your tasking. And later on, you might have a 230103 or even a 23010201, right? Depending on how far you're drilling down into the details of the target. Anyway, yeah, I talk about this. In fact, we get into great detail about how, at least how I suggest people do it in my operational remote viewing class, which I'll probably offer one of those next winter in Vegas. We'll see what happens. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, as I hear you talking about these numbers, I still have this earworm from the song.
Oh yes, 8675309. Yep.
Yeah. So if you are the viewer, Paul, and you get a retasking, different number, same target, or follow-up target, did you recognize you had this target again before? Did you erkennt man das
So
wieder?
yeah, I see what you're getting at. Bill will probably have some stories on his own, but just quickly to answer your question, sometimes yes, sometimes no. It all depends. And yeah, so one of the reasons when you might not is because remember now you're doing a different aspect of the first target, right? Particularly if you've described the outside of a structure before and the next tasking is describe the inside of the structure, you may not recognize that it's the same thing. So, and other times because you may come in just from a different perspective and it may not strike you as the same. It also has to do with how recently you've done this. Like if you do it one point and then 2 months later they come back with this retasking, you might not recognize it. So anyway, go ahead, Bill. Maybe you have some examples.
I agree. If the original tasking was of a compound with numerous buildings, and one of the ones you described was the item of interest, and you go back and that's the new target. You're no longer going for the compound. You're going for a singular building. You may or may not recognize it as you get there. I've been in places and then been sent back to places, and I realized I've been here before. This is a retasking on something. I've been in places and recognized I've been here in real life, and later I've been in places in real life and I recognized I've been here psychically before. And yeah, it's never quite sure. It's a deja vu feeling. I think I've been here before. Sometimes it's fairly obvious if it's a very unique place. Yeah, this is, I got sent to the Kremlin once a month. And that was, after a while, it's a very unique building, so you can figure out this is where I am. I've been here before.
I have to tell you, in my training experiences, so I generally try not to give my students the same target that they've had before again, unless there is some teaching reason for it. Okay, because you might as well maximize, diversify the number of targets they have. But every once in a while, I'll make a mistake and I won't look at my records and I'll give them the same target. And this has happened probably 3 or 4 times over the last 20 years. And in probably 3 of those 4 times, I'd give the target to the viewer, to the student, and they'd be working it and they're working. And they get about halfway through and said, "I've done this target before." And I'll say, "No, you haven't." And say, "Yes, I have." Okay. And then I'll go back and I'll look through my record because I have it right there with me. And sure enough, 6 months before I gave them that target and they recognize it, And so from one perspective, it's kind of a lost training opportunity because it's not a different target. They are not going to learn as much as they would having done a different target. Because once they recognize it as a target, they might as well not even continue because then it'll all be memory, not remote viewing. But on the other hand, it's hugely confidence building for them because they realize this really does work because I knew that was that target and not even the monitor knew it was that target. It was the same target I'd worked. So, that's really great when that happens. But again, it isn't what I wanted as a training objective for that particular session. So.
Mhm.
Well, by the time I got to the project, in very early 84, January 3rd, ERV was the way they were working. Joe did ERV, and we had the Ingo contract. I think CRV is much easier to teach. I could be wrong on that, because CRV you have 6 steps or perhaps more, and each one, my opinion is CRV, the only hard part is step 1. Step 1's a bitch. Pardon my language. And if you'll notice, most people, experienced viewers, will take the coordinates one time on step 1, then get out of it and move on to the rest of it. But step 1 is the key into everything else. And after that, everything just kind of comes. 2 starts coming in automatically. Then when 2 peters out, 3 starts coming in. So it's an easy way to teach. And it gives you a structure, which you don't really have in ERV. So the monitor, the analyst can follow and see where the person went out of structure and then evaluate the information accordingly. ERV is more exciting. ERV is more like being there. It's more, I think ERV is more what people who know nothing about remote viewing think remote viewing is, because you get this PSI.vision of what's going on at the site. It's not like you're there, but it's like you're there, if I can. And so we use Joe ERV and the Ingo trained viewers CRV. And after Joe left, that's when I went to Skip and said, "Skip, I would like to learn ERV." So we have the option of using more ERV. And he said, "Sure, fine. Monday morning, we'll try it." And so I came in Monday morning and we ERV'd, and I was assumed I'd get some instruction or something on it, but never did. And the first time I tried it, it worked. And Paul was the outbounder, and it was amazing. So that's, and then everybody else started ERVing also. So you had the ability to target Paul against something ERV and me against the CRV or vice versa. So we could use, because you can do some things ERV that we can't do yet in CRV, and you can do some things in CRV you can't do yet in ERV. I think that will change. If you can do it in one remote viewing style, I think you can do it in both. We just haven't figured out how yet.
So Bill, what was that first target? Do you remember?
Yes, that was. It was a nursery in Laurel, and it was this huge greenhouse.
Okay.
Yep, and I did the dimensions were correct. What you were doing was correct, but it didn't. And it's PSI.vision. It's not really seeing, but it is seeing, and it looked different. But I knew that's where I was when we went back out after the outbounder. Yep, and that was
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Bill says he liked ERV. I didn't, because they kept waking me up from a good nap. I would just get into the zone, and then Skip would come in and start talking to me. I want to say, shut up, Skip. I want to go back to sleep. So, and maybe at this point we really ought to mention what ERV is, right? And so
you go ahead.
yeah, in CRV, you're sitting at a table, you have a stack of paper, you'll often have a monitor at the other end, and you're very much starting off in a wide awake state. In ERV, you're actually laying down, at least the way you used to do it, you're laying down on a bed, and you're trying to set up a hypnagogic state, which is mind awake, body asleep. Although even your mind isn't all that awake, you're sort of trying to get on the edge between being asleep and awake. The theory is that if you're in that position, you're less likely to get the left brain interference that leads to mental noise. I never really found that to be true, but some folks do really well with it. So that's the goal, to establish that state. It's usually a fairly dim room. Then you have a monitor there with a dim light so they can read and write, who is asking you questions, kind of guiding your attention, and so on. So that's kind of the distinction. And ERV originated it was a development of Skip Atwater's. He went to the Monroe Institute long before, I don't say long before, at the very early days of the program, probably in 1977, because he was collecting information about how they should go about remote viewing. He talked to the SRI folks and learned how they were doing it. Went to the Monroe Institute, and of course, at the Monroe Institute, they weren't doing remote viewing. They were doing this kind of semi-conscious, sometimes out of body, mind awake, body asleep kinds of situations, where you have the hemisync, the binaural beats to set up a frequency following response in the brain, and so on, right? So he learned about that. He learned about hemisync, and in fact, when they started doing training for the new viewers, including Joe McMoneagle, Mel Riley, Ken Bell, and some others, he used hemisync to induce this kind of state. And when I did my first ERV, and I actually did only ERV up until 1984 when we went to train with Ingo. So over a three-month period, that's the kind of remote viewing I did, right? So we'd start off, we'd get a focus 10, as they called it, hemisync tape, sometimes focus 12. We'd get in this mind awake, body asleep, mind awake, body asleep state, and then we do an outbounder, right? And so that's how ERV developed. It was a combination of Monroe Institute, SRI input, although they weren't intending to create this methodology. This was Skip bringing things through.
Yeah, Skip, excited there.
Yes. Excuse me. Skip bringing things together. There might even have been a little bit of ARE stuff in there, like Edgar Casey, the sleeping, they call him the sleeping prophet, right? I don't know, actually. I had never thought to ask Skip whether he had any input from that concept or not, but that's kind of how it developed. And then Bill became a real practitioner of this. He was much more, he much more enjoyed ERV than I did. Of course, part of that was, Bill hadn't told you this, but he actually fractured his spine in a jump accident when he was in the airborne status. It was 101st, right? When
Right.
it happens, the 101st Airborne, when they still use parachutes. he had a training accident and fractured his spine, and so laying on a bed is a whole lot more comfortable for him than sitting in a hard chair. So that also played a role in his ERV, but in general, he really kind of took to it.
I'm kind of an adrenaline junkie, and I found ERV more exciting. But yeah, the thing
That's
about
his story.
ERV,
He's sticking to it.
yes, but the thing
Okay.
about ERV is it's like there's this it's like you're skin diving, scuba diving, and there's this depth. You have to stay in between here and here. If you go up too high towards the surface, you come out of the state you're in, and you may not be able to get back into it without some effort. And if you go too deep, people say you go to sleep, but I don't think so. I think you go someplace else. You just don't know where that is. And then you come back, it's like waking up, but you've been gone. So it's staying in between those two levels and listening to the monitor and then trying to get the target. When I first got to the project, we had 2 secretaries. And the reason we had 2 was because they had to transcribe the tape of Joe. And it's, when you are in the altered state, it's like you're talking with a mouth full of mush and marbles. And it's, yeah. What did he say? And it's very difficult. So we had 2 people basically translating for the viewers, and we didn't have that many viewers at the time.
So let's clarify what you mean by protocol here. I think that's important. Joe McMonagle makes this distinction between protocol and method. I'm not sure the distinction is as clear as he thinks it is, but nonetheless, protocol is kind of the conditions under which you do an experiment, and the method is the process by which you do the experiment. So in how do you mean protocol? I think you probably mean method. Is that right, Theo?
Yes, I mean, in this case, I mean, yeah, a method that you can reproduce it and can teach it to other people, stuff like that.
I'm sure there is. I have had problems teaching ERV because the way I learned it, we would, you know, I had monitored Joe McMonagle when he was working many times, and Skip would be in as the monitor, and I would be in the control room listening, and but we had Joe hooked up to some galvanic skin responses and other things, so I knew the what Joe's body was like when he was on target. And so that morning, Monday morning, when I went into ERV, I knew how to duplicate the state Joe was in. I could make my galvanic skin responses the same as his. I could reverse polarity the way he was. So I could do that. And that's the only thing I knew. So I did that. And eventually the signal line came by and I hopped on. And the signal line is the same in ERV as it is in CRV, at least that's the way I perceive it. I perceive it, it's stronger than in ERV, not because you're more in contact with it, but that's what that's the state you're in, you're looking for. But I have not tried to teach anybody ERV. Well, a couple of my kids have been able to do it, yes. And but it's so much easier teaching CRV because you go 1, 2, 3, and then on, and they just lead into each other. It's a natural progression.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think
ERV, it's a matter of, yeah, and that's one of the benefits of ERV is you're on the target immediately. With CRV, you have to get up to stage 4 before you start getting, at least usually, before you start getting valuable information that you can go ahead. Yeah. Whereas
I think you could think about method as maybe the container for the signal, right? And you can think of it in those terms. And from a methodological, a formal kind of a basis, ERV is very simple. It's you lay on a bed, you set up this state, this mind awake, body asleep state. You have somebody come in and essentially ask you questions. That's what the format boils down to. So in that sense, there's not much of a method to it. Now, of course, the trick here is as the viewer to learn to recognize when you've got signal. Although that's not as excruciatingly important in any remote viewing methodology in terms of recognizing when you're on. The goal really is to learn to just let go and verbalize and sketch what you're experiencing without judging whether it's on or not. You just become a conduit. It's not your job to know whether you're on or not. If you reach that state, it doesn't matter whether you're doing ERV or CRV, you're going to start producing real data. People run aground on the problem of, well, what I'm saying right or is what I'm saying wrong? I don't want to say anything that's wrong. I just want to say what's right. Well, you are going to only say wrong stuff if that's what you're thinking, right? You need to learn not to care about whether what you're saying is right or wrong, because then when you let go, I've been for almost 40 years now talking about remote viewing being a Zen-like process, right? In Zen, you don't care about the outcome, you just care about the process. In remote viewing, you don't care about the outcome, you care about the process, how you're doing it, what you're not the validity of what you're saying. Forget that part. Just download information. Don't judge it, just download it. And that is the main principle in both CRV and ERV. If you do that, you will ultimately become perfectly good at this.
Yeah, I would, something Joe once said, it's just made a lot of sense to me. And that is, Joe said, I have never been wedded to any session. When the session's done, walk away from it. That's, yep. Don't have to go back and defend it. Don't have to, yep. This is what I found at the time. If it's wrong, if it's right. Yep. The thing with ERV is against CRV. CRV can be done without a monitor. I think ERV would be exceptionally hard to do without a monitor.
There are people who claim you don't need a monitor to do it. I am really skeptical of whether those produce any kind of high quality results if you don't have one.
I agree.
Yeah, and there is a border to clairvoyance or channeling or whatever. Before you said stage 1 is the hardest part on CRV.
I think it is.
Yeah.
It's the only part where you have to make a decision. Yeah, it's the only.
Okay.
You got to say what the feeling and motion is. It's the only time through the whole process that you have to put yourself out there. And I've seen students, they'll do that straight line, and they'll, if I say fluidy, then I'm locked into water. If I say solid, then I'm locked into land. And if I say, so it's, but once you get past that, everything else is going to come. It's, stage 2 will come in at a time. And then it's just, all you got to do is copy down what's coming in. And then eventually you're going to get to the dimensions, and you're going to be in stage 3. You can start moving around and drawing. And when that starts petering out, you can just write up your matrix, and but it all comes. And after you've done your A's and B's, it's pretty much going to happen once you learn it all and have the experience.
Yeah,
I may be simplifying it, Paul, but that's always been my feeling. And I think that's why that experienced remote viewers will only take the coordinate one time. Because it's hard.
Yeah, it's not strictly true. As far as taking the coordinate, I mean, I take it as often as necessary, right? If I get an or a confusion break, I definitely retake it. Interestingly, Ingo, So there's this interesting debate. So Ed Dames, when he was, I guess he's still teaching, would make his students take the coordinate 3 times, whether they needed to or not. Even if they were on the first time, they take it again, they take it again, right? And I thought, well, that's just ridiculous. If you take it the first time and it works fine, then you keep on going, right? Well, going back through my notes and actually having some recollection, Ingo encouraged you to take the coordinate as often as you needed to. So there are some people, and Bill's not the one I'm talking about here. There are some people who say, no, you should only take the coordinate once and then go on. Because if you don't, then you're implying that you somehow failed the first time to get it right, right? No, that's not the point. The point is you want to get a good lock on the signal and continue. So if that takes more than one iteration of the coordinate, fine. If it doesn't, then fine. If you one is enough, that's fine. So that's, that's stage 1 is a pain in the butt. I was the one I hated the worst. Really.
I think I used those exact words, Paul.
Yeah. And I don't tell my students that until after they're through stage 1, because I don't want them knowing that I hated it too at that point. It's come very natural to me now, and it will to them as well, because every time they do a CRV session, they'll be doing stage 1. But the key is that feeling motion part. And you'll hear Tom talk about this all the time in stage. And there's this big argument about ideograms, right? But the really key to it is actually, well, I call it motion feeling. Ingo called it feeling motion. But the reason I've changed that to motion feeling is because it actually is the motion part you experience first. The feeling is what comes next, right? Feeling meaning the consistency of the target. You can actually experience that right there on the page as you're creating an ideogram. You can actually experience the term I like to use, experience the motion that your hand executes as it makes the shape on the page. I'm working on a video that's going to talk about this as well, but when we say motion, we're not talking about the motion of making the line. We're talking the motion of making the ideogram, and they're not the same thing. The line is the mark, the trace that doing an ideogram in 2 dimensions on the page is, what that leaves behind. The ideogram itself is a 3-dimensional, even really kind of a 4-dimensional thing. And oftentimes you'll be making a mark on a page and you will feel the ideogram having elements that are not on the page that emerge up out, whatever, right? I don't want to get in great detail on this. I'm sorry to get off on a real tangent with this, but it is really a kinesthetic experience. It's absolutely core to this, that you experience the motion and then you experience the feeling, the consistency of the target. And that's what Bill's talking about. Now, here's what's hard. It's very subtle. You're coming in from stone cold sober, if you will, you're totally in a conscious state. And you have to be psychic right out of the gate. Okay, you don't get a chance to think about it. If you think about it, you're already lost. You have to let it happen, and you have to avoid making any judgments at all. You just get the experience of doing it. You allow it to happen. You describe what your experience was on the page. That's what the A and the B that Bill's talking about. And you're into the session. But that first bit can be a real challenge to capture because it is subtle. And if you're not used to it, which no one starting CRV is, if you're not used to it, it can be a real challenge to understand what it is that the teacher is trying to get you to understand, right?
Well put.
So we had this picture today when we were talking about this, that the learning stage 1 is like learning to start a car with a gear shift.
To jumpstart a car, let's see.
The start the car with a gear shift. You clutch in.
Get somebody to push
a little
it.
bit of gas.
Yeah.
So interesting. Oh, you mean a car with a gear shift just to start it? You don't mean to jump start it, like give it a push.
Yeah. If you are in driving school, the biggest part is to learn how to start the car. Since we in Germany we have gear shift cars. And not automatic.
Yeah. I always like going over to Europe and renting a car because I get to go back to gear shift. It's really hard to find a car here that isn't an automatic.
Yeah.
Except in Ireland and England, where you got to shift with the wrong hand.
Yeah, I'll take the bus there.
or you can do this. Yeah. Of course, you think you're in fourth and you're actually in reverse. So,
Okay. All right.
you want to go first, Paul? You want me to?
I'll just say a good one. I would want to see a good future for remote viewing. Go ahead, Bill.
I would like to see it more widely accepted. I think that's, but I would like to see us, 40 years ago, we assumed that we'd be a lot further along, I think, than we are. I think we made progress in, the first 4 or 5 years, first 10 years, but we're moving ahead. We're learning things, new things are coming up, but we aren't where I expected to be. It's talked about freely now. You can talk about RB. Most people know, I've heard something about it. It's getting more out there. It's getting more accepted. I would like to see it become more predictable. I would like to see it more accepted as from a military use, as a one more type of intelligence. It's very cheap. It's when you compare the salary of 12 people against putting a satellite up and then maintaining it and all the work that goes with that, or even some of the other forms, running human sources is not only a costly, but a dangerous. There are things we could do with it. I think learning it opens you up to being able to perceive the world in ways that I do now that I didn't before I knew about it. I know more about myself. I think I'm a better judge of character. It's improved me as an individual, I think. And if nothing else, that was worthwhile. And it was a hell of a lot of fun.
And remains so, right?
And remains so to this day, yes. And it's, the watching a student all of a sudden see that epiphany is, that's amazing. They all of a sudden, and for me, I knew at the start, I knew it was possible because Ingo could do it and other people could do it. I wasn't sure I could do it. And that feeling, first time where you nail something. Wonderful.
So you have to remember when Bill and I came into this, it was just barely 11 years since that very first experiment between Hal and Ingo. So we were in at the earlier end of this project. And now we are much young. Say again?
I was very young. I just
was very young. Yes, yes. And naive. Well, maybe not naive.
Still am, as a matter of fact.
Now we're many years down the road. And my concern is that Bill's desires for the future of remote viewing, I absolutely echo those. But there's a really big obstacle in the way. And ironically, it's not what you think it is. It is actually the remote viewers themselves, in a certain sense. The problem is, when they developed remote viewing in the first place, they stripped away all of the cultural baggage that ESP, that being psychic, had attached to it, and tried to make it a strictly scientific pursuit, boil it down to just what they could show evidence for, just what they could support from terms of human perception and so on and so forth. Avoid any of these metaphysical stories like, whatever, shamanism, whatever, that people use to explain being psychic, oftentimes from, past history and stuff. And we actually succeeded in preserving that up until 1995 when it became public, because once the public got a hold of it, they tended to want to try and fit it into the framework that they understood. And so even today, you'll get people coming into the remote viewing groups and saying, oh, well, this is just like channeling, or this is just like X, or just like Y, or they'll start, even though you might call it remote viewing, they'll inject some of these previous metaphysics notions into it, like third eye. Oh, you're activating your third eye and all that kind of stuff. That's the very stuff that they wanted to get rid of in the early days of remote viewing up through the military program. And getting rid of that was so productive to the remote viewing process. And now we have a vast majority, I won't say vast majority, but a vast number of people, a vast clamor, racket of people making this claim or the other claim or another claim or this claim over here or another claim, or trying to fit it into their own particular worldview or whatever. And it's essentially the community is in chaos. And I don't have, as long as that chaos rules, it is going to act as an anchor on the progress of remote viewing. There are actually a few folks within that who are really doing fairly serious attempts to continue exploring remote viewing outside of the metaphysical noise that we're getting. And to some degree, I think they've made some progress, particularly in the ARV world. They're exploring that. And because, of course, in ARV, if you get it wrong, you lose money, right? So there's a kind of enforcement mechanism in there to have your head screwed on straight. You may do an experiment, it may not work, but at least you've learned what doesn't work, right? And so the next time you won't do it that way, you'll try something different. So in that world, because there is money on the line, they, I think, are actually doing some fairly decent exploration. But outside of that, particularly in the popular remote viewing world, it's been welded to UFOs and ETs and conspiracy theories and all this stuff, and it's just undermining the perceived legitimacy of remote viewing in the mainstream's eye. Back when it first came out, I'm sorry, I'm on a soapbox here, I know. But back when it first came out, actually, mainstream scientists were more inclined to look at it, or at least give it a chance, than they were after it started being connected with the UFOs and the weird phenomenon stuff. Once that happened, these mainstream said, I'm not going to have anything to do with that. That's just a big circus out there. And I think that's part of the reason why we haven't made progress, is because of the way relatively uninformed people or overly emotionally driven people in what is the remote viewing community today are treating it, looking at it. Okay, lecture over.
There is a tremendous amount of ego in the RV community.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
much more so than in the normal communities.
That's not true. No, there's just as much ego in the other communities. It's just that they aren't frontier field where you can get away with wearing your ego on your sleeve. It's people talk about, well, there's always this huge amount of fighting in remote viewing. Why is it true of remote viewing and nowhere else? Well, that's not true. It is absolutely true of other places as well. It's typical human psychology that's going on here. It's just that this field doesn't have set boundaries in the way that other more established fields do. So okay, now I put you all to sleep. I'm sorry.
No, that's good. Thank you.
It's a good point. Paul, thank you for your lecture. Not only this one, all of them. It was great, really good. Yeah, we have written about that, and we will do again. And you have made you have had very much work to create thousands of PowerPoint slides.
Yes.
To ask questions, so we can recommend to any other viewer out there to use this.
So Bill has created just as many PowerPoint slides, but they all had to do with Afghanistan and Iraq. They didn't have much to do with
Unfortunately, yes.
Okay.
Adrenaline junkie.